The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy streets of downtown as Detective Riley Thompson stepped out of his black SUV. 15 years he had been doing this job. 15 long years of high-stakes situations, dangerous criminals, and split-second decisions that could mean life or death. His SWAT team had seen it all: bank robberies, hostage situations, drug raids. You name it, they had handled it, but today was different. Today, he was being asked to do something that felt completely beneath his skill level. Security consultation. At some fancy embassy event. Riley shook his head as he grabbed his gear bag from the back seat. This was the kind of assignment they usually gave to rookie cops or regular patrol officers. Not to someone with his experience and training. The British embassy stood before him like something out of a movie. Tall iron gates, perfectly manicured gardens, and stone walls that looked like they had been standing for centuries. Everything about this place screamed old money and tradition. Riley had grown up in a working-class neighborhood where people solved problems with their fists and their wits. This world of diplomats and fancy protocols felt foreign to him. As he approached the main entrance, Riley noticed the guards standing at attention. Two men in bright red uniforms with those ridiculous tall black hats that looked like something from a costume party. They stood perfectly still, their eyes focused straight ahead, not moving a muscle. Riley had to admit they looked impressive from a distance. But he knew the difference between looking tough and actually being tough. One of the guards was a man in his early 30s with broad shoulders and a serious expression. His uniform was perfectly pressed, every button polished to a mirror shine. His boots were so clean they could have been used as mirrors. This guard had been standing in the same position for what looked like hours, never shifting his weight or breaking his focus. Riley walked closer, studying the setup with his trained eye. In his world, security meant being ready to move, to react, to take action at a moment's notice. These guards looked more like statues than actual protection. Sure, they might scare off tourists or make the place look official, but what would they do in a real emergency? The detective had seen enough action movies to know how these royal guard types were supposed to work. They were trained to stand still no matter what happened around them. People could make faces at them, try to distract them, even talk to them, and they would not react. It was all about discipline and following orders. But Riley wondered what good that kind of training would do when bullets started flying. His radio crackled to life, bringing him back to the present moment. The voice of his supervisor came through clearly, giving him the basic rundown of his duties for the day. Provide security consultation during a diplomatic reception. Make sure the perimeter was secure. Check for any potential threats or security weaknesses. Standard stuff, really, except for the fancy location. Riley had been hoping for something more exciting today, maybe a drug bust or a high-speed chase. Something that would get his blood pumping and remind him why he loved this job. Instead, he was stuck babysitting diplomats and making small talk with embassy staff. The whole situation felt like a waste of his talents and experience. As he made his way through the security checkpoint, Riley could not help but notice how different everything was here compared to his usual work environment. At the police station, things were loud, chaotic, and always moving. Phones ringing, people shouting orders, the constant buzz of activity. Here, everything was quiet and controlled. Even the way people walked seemed more careful and deliberate. The embassy staff who greeted him were polite but distant. They spoke with those fancy British accents that made everything sound more important than it actually was. Riley found himself nodding along as they explained the day's schedule and protocols, but his mind was already wandering to more important things. He thought about the real criminals out there on the streets. While he was standing around in this museum-like building, drug dealers were probably making deals, thieves were planning their next heist, and dangerous people were walking free. That was where he should be, out there making a real difference, not playing dress-up security guard at some fancy party. The British official leading his orientation was a thin man with perfectly combed hair and a clipboard full of notes. He spoke in a soft, measured tone about the importance of diplomatic relations and international cooperation. Riley tried to look interested, but he could feel his patience wearing thin. All this talk about protocol and procedure seemed unnecessary, when what really mattered was keeping people safe. When they reached the main courtyard where the reception would be held, Riley finally got a good look at the security setup. The two royal guards were positioned at key points around the area, standing like they had been carved from stone. Their presence was clearly meant to be ceremonial, but Riley could not shake the feeling that they were more of a liability than an asset. In his experience, the best security was invisible security. You wanted your protection to blend in, to move freely, to be able to respond quickly to any threat. These guards in their bright red uniforms were about as subtle as a fire truck. Anyone with bad intentions would spot them immediately and plan. Accordingly, Riley began to formulate his own ideas about how the security should be handled. He had years of tactical training and real-world experience that these ceremonial guards simply could not match. If he were in charge, he would reposition the guards, change their patrol patterns, and set up better sight lines for maximum coverage. The more he thought about it, the more confident he became that his approach was superior. After all, he had been trained by some of the best law enforcement professionals in the country. He had handled situations that would make most people freeze with fear. These embassy guards, with all their fancy uniforms and traditional training, were probably more suited for tourist photos than actual security work. As the morning wore on and the first guests began to arrive, Riley watched everything with a critical eye. He noted potential security weaknesses, escape routes, and areas where threats might emerge. It was automatic for him now, after so many years on the job. But he also found himself growing more frustrated with what he saw as an outdated and ineffective security approach. The royal guard in the courtyard remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Riley had to admit there was something impressive about that level of discipline, but he also wondered if it was really the best use of the security professional's skills. In his world, awareness meant constantly scanning for threats, staying alert to changes in the environment, and being ready to move at a moment's notice. Little did Riley know that his growing frustration and confidence in his own methods were setting the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. The clash between his aggressive, action-oriented approach and the traditional, disciplined methods of the Royal Guard was about to create a situation that neither man could have predicted. The stage was set for a meeting of two very different worlds, two very different approaches to security and authority. And in a few short hours, the consequences of that meeting would ripple far beyond the walls of the British Embassy. 3 hours into the diplomatic reception, the embassy courtyard was buzzing with activity. Well-dressed guests moved between elegant tables covered in white cloth, while waiters in crisp uniforms carried silver trays of appetizers and champagne. The sound of polite conversation mixed with classical music from a string quartet positioned near the main entrance. Riley had been walking the perimeter for what felt like forever, checking and double-checking security measures that seemed perfectly adequate to everyone except him. His trained eye kept spotting what he considered obvious flaws in the setup. The guest flow patterns were creating bottlenecks. The emergency exits were not clearly marked. And most importantly, those ceremonial guards were standing in positions that made no tactical sense whatsoever. The Royal Guard he had been observing all morning was still in the same spot, about 20 feet from the main refreshment area. His name tag read Wellington, and he looked to be in his early 30s. The guy had impressive posture. Riley had to give him that. But from a security standpoint, his position was all wrong. Riley could see at least 3 blind spots from where Wellington was standing. If someone wanted to cause trouble, they could easily approach from the east side without being noticed. There was also a service entrance nearby that was not being properly monitored. In Riley's opinion, Wellington should be moved at least 15 feet to the left, closer to the main pathway where he could observe both the guests and the potential problem areas. The more Riley thought about it, the more convinced he became that he needed to take action. After all, he was here as a security consultant. That meant his job was to identify problems and fix them, right? He had been doing this kind of work for 15 years. He knew what he was talking about. A group of diplomats walked past. their conversation filled with words like trade agreements and international cooperation. Riley nodded politely, but his attention remained focused on the security situation. He pulled out his notebook and started sketching a better layout for the guard positions. If he could just move Wellington and maybe adjust the patrol routes, the whole area would be much more secure. Riley approached Wellington with the confidence of someone who had handled hundreds of security situations. The guard was standing perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead, completely motionless except for the occasional blink. His red uniform looked even more impressive up close, with gold buttons and detailed embroidery that must have taken hours to complete. "Hey there," Riley said, stopping a few feet away from the guard. "I'm Detective Thompson with the Metro SWAT unit. I'm here doing security consultation for this event." Wellington did not turn his head or acknowledge the comment. His eyes remained fixed on the same distant point they had been watching all morning. This was exactly what Riley had expected. He had heard about these Royal Guards and their training to ignore distractions. But this was not a distraction. This was official business. Riley stepped closer and spoke a little louder. "Listen, I need you to move to a different position. There are some security concerns with where you're standing right now." Still no response. Wellington continued staring straight ahead like Riley was not even there. A few guests nearby started to notice the one-sided conversation, but they quickly looked away and continued with their own discussions. Riley felt his patience starting to wear thin. He understood that these guards had their traditions and protocols. But this was about safety, real safety, not just ceremony. He pulled out his badge and held it where Wellington could see it without turning his head. "Look, I'm not trying to cause problems here. I'm law enforcement just like you, well, sort of like you. I'm trying to help make this event more secure." For the first time, Wellington's eyes shifted slightly. Not his head, just his eyes, glancing down at the badge for a brief moment before returning to their original position. Then, in a quiet but clear voice, he spoke. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but I cannot leave my assigned position without direct orders from my commanding officer." Riley blinked in surprise. After hours of complete silence, the guard had finally spoken. But instead of being helpful, he was being difficult. "Your commanding officer? Look, this is about security. I'm trying to help you do your job better." "Sir, I understand your position," Wellington replied, still looking straight ahead. "But I have very specific orders about where I am to stand and what I am to do. I cannot abandon my post." Riley looked around the courtyard, trying to spot anyone who might be Wellington's superior. He saw embassy staff, diplomats, and other guests, but no one who looked like they were in charge of the guards. "Okay, well, where is your commanding officer? Can we get him over here?" "Colonel Hayes is currently in meetings with embassy officials. He will be available after the reception concludes." This was getting ridiculous. Riley had dealt with military types before, and he knew they could be rigid about following orders. But this was a simple request that would improve security for everyone. Why was this guy being so stubborn? "Listen, Wellington," Riley said, reading the name tag again. "I've been doing security work for 15 years. I know what I'm talking about. If you move just 15 feet to your left, you'll have a much better view of the entire area. You'll be able to do your job more effectively." Wellington finally turned his head slightly to look at Riley directly. "Sir, with respect, I have been trained extensively in embassy security protocols. My position was chosen based on careful analysis of sight lines, emergency procedures, and coordination with other security personnel. I cannot move without authorization." Riley felt his frustration building. Here was a guy who was clearly intelligent and well-trained, but he was being completely inflexible. "Look, I'm not asking you to abandon your post. I'm asking you to move to a better post. It's still security work, just in a smarter location. I understand your perspective, sir, but I have my orders." By now, their conversation was attracting more attention. Several guests had stopped their own discussions to watch the interaction between the American detective and the British guard. A few people had even pulled out their phones, though Riley did not notice this yet. Riley tried a different approach. "Okay, what if I take responsibility? What if I officially request that you move to improve security coverage? I'm here in an official capacity. Wellington remained polite but firm. Sir, I appreciate your offer, but my chain of command is very clear. I report to Colonel Hayes, and only Colonel Hayes can authorize changes to my position or duties. Riley could not believe what he was hearing. Here was a security professional who was more concerned with following rules than actually providing security. In Riley's world, you adapted to situations. You made decisions based on what was happening in real time. You did not just stand around waiting for permission when there was an obvious problem to solve. This is unbelievable, Riley muttered, loud enough for Wellington to hear. You're more worried about protocol than actually doing your job. Wellington's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his professional composure. Sir, following protocol is part of doing my job. Embassy security requires coordination and communication. I cannot simply abandon my assigned duties. Riley looked around the courtyard again, his frustration growing by the minute. More guests were watching now, and he could see embassy staff starting to notice the discussion. This was supposed to be a simple security consultation, not a debate about military protocol. What Riley did not realize was that Wellington had 8 years of experience in Royal Protection Services. He had worked at Buckingham Palace, protected, visiting dignitaries, and handled security for dozens of high-profile events. His training was not just about standing still, it was about understanding complex security systems and following protocols that had been developed over decades of experience, but to Riley, all of that training looked like stubborn inflexibility. And his growing anger was about to turn a professional disagreement into something much more serious. Riley's voice was getting louder, and he did not even realize it. What had started as a quiet conversation between two security professionals was quickly turning into something much more public. The classical music from the string quartet seemed to fade into the background as more and more guests began to notice the heated discussion taking place near the refreshment area. This is exactly what's wrong with you military types, Riley said, his frustration finally boiling over. You're so caught up in following orders that you can't think for yourselves. I'm trying to help you here, and you're acting like I'm asking you to commit a crime. Wellington's face remained calm, but there was a slight tightness around his eyes that showed he was not as unaffected as he appeared. Sir, I am thinking for myself. I'm thinking about the safety of everyone at this event, which requires following established security protocols. A small group of diplomats had stopped their conversation entirely and were now watching the exchange with obvious concern. One woman in an elegant blue dress whispered something to her companion, who immediately pulled out his phone. Riley noticed the phones, but assumed people were just checking messages or taking pictures of the embassy gardens. Established protocols? Riley laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your established protocol has you standing in a spot where you can't see half the courtyard. That's not security, that's just standing around looking pretty for the tourists. This comment hit a nerve. Wellington had spent years training for his position, had served in Afghanistan, and had protected members of the royal family. Being dismissed as a tourist attraction was deeply insulting, but his training kept him from showing it. Sir, my position was chosen based on careful analysis by security professionals with decades of experience. Oh, really? Riley stepped closer, invading Wellington's personal space. And where are these security professionals now? Are they here dealing with the actual situation? Or are they sitting in some office somewhere making plans that don't work in the real world? By now, at least 15 people were openly staring at the confrontation. The embassy staff had noticed too, and Riley could see a man in a dark suit speaking urgently into a radio near entrance. But Riley was too focused on his argument. With Wellington to worry about the growing audience, Wellington's military training was screaming at him to maintain discipline. But Riley's dismissive attitude was making it harder and harder to stay calm. Sir, with all due respect, you don't understand the complexity of embassy security. This isn't just about watching for threats. It's about international relations, diplomatic protocol, and coordination with multiple agencies. International relations? Riley's voice rose another notch. Let me tell you something about international relations. When the shooting starts, nobody cares about your diplomatic protocol. They care about whether the security team can actually protect them. A distinguished older gentleman with a British accent approached them cautiously. Excuse me, gentlemen, but perhaps this discussion would be better continued in a more private setting? Riley turned to face the newcomer, his face flushed with anger. And who are you? Ambassador Richardson, and this is my embassy. I would very much appreciate it if you could lower your voice and resolve this matter quietly. But Riley was past the point of caring about diplomatic niceties. Ambassador, I'm trying to improve your security here, and your guard is being completely unreasonable. I've got 15 years of experience in law enforcement, and this guy won't listen to a simple suggestion. Ambassador Richardson looked between Riley and Wellington, clearly trying to assess the situation. I'm sure we can work this out. Wellington, perhaps you could explain your position to the detective. Wellington straightened his already perfect posture. Sir, Detective Thompson has suggested that I move from my assigned position. I've explained that I cannot do so without authorization from my commanding officer, but he continues to insist. There you go again with the authorization nonsense, Riley interrupted. This is about safety, not paperwork. In my job, when we see a problem, we fix it. We don't stand around waiting for someone to sign a form. The crowd of onlookers was growing larger. What had started with a few curious diplomats was now a circle of at least 20 people, all watching the argument unfold. Several phones were now clearly pointed in their direction, recording everything. The string quartet had even stopped playing, creating an uncomfortable silence broken only by Riley's increasingly loud voice. Wellington could see the situation spiraling out of control, but he was trapped between his duty to maintain his post and his desire to defuse the confrontation. Detective Thompson, I understand your frustration, but creating a scene at a diplomatic event is not helping anyone's security. Creating a scene? Riley looked around at the crowd for the first time, finally noticing how many people were watching. Instead of being embarrassed, he seemed to get even angrier. You want to talk about creating a scene? You're the one who turned a simple security suggestion into some kind of international incident. Ambassador Richardson tried again to calm things down. Gentlemen, please. We have guests from 12 different countries here today. This kind of disagreement reflects poorly on everyone involved, but Riley was beyond reasoning with. All his frustration from the boring assignment, the fancy protocols, and Wellington's stubborn refusal to listen had built up into real anger. You know what reflects poorly? Having security guards who are more worried about looking good than actually providing security. Wellington's face finally showed some emotion. A flash of anger crossed his features before he controlled it. Sir, you know nothing about what I do or how I was trained. You've been here for 3 hours and think you understand security systems that took years to develop. I know enough to see when something isn't working, Riley shot back. And I know enough to recognize when someone is too proud to admit they're wrong. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Embassy staff were now moving through the crowd, trying to discreetly encourage guests to move to other areas of the courtyard. But many people remained, fascinated by the unexpected drama unfolding before them. One young woman with a press badge had her phone held high, making sure to capture every word of the argument. She recognized good material when she saw it, and this confrontation between an American law enforcement officer and a British Royal Guard was exactly the kind of story that would go viral within hours. Wellington made one final attempt to end the confrontation professionally. Detective Thompson, I suggest we contact my commanding officer and your supervisor to resolve this matter through proper channels. Riley laughed bitterly. Proper channels? You mean more bureaucracy and red tape? No thanks. I've had enough of your proper channels and your protocols and your authorization requirements. The ambassador stepped forward again, his voice more firm this time. Detective Thompson, I must insist that you lower your voice. This behavior is completely inappropriate for a diplomatic venue. But Riley was too angry to care about diplomatic appropriateness. 15 years of dealing with criminals and dangerous situations had given him a very direct approach to solving problems. And right now, Wellington felt like a problem that needed solving. "You want to know what's inappropriate?" Riley said, his voice echoing across the now silent courtyard. "What's inappropriate is having security that's more concerned with looking fancy than actually working." Wellington's jaw clenched. He had endured insults to his intelligence, his training, and his professionalism. But this attack on his dedication to his duty was the final straw. For the first time since the conversation began, real anger flashed in his eyes. The two men stood facing each other in the middle of the elegant courtyard, surrounded by shocked diplomats and embassy staff. Phones continued recording, capturing every tense moment. Neither man realized how quickly this confrontation was about to escalate beyond anything either of them had imagined. The courtyard had fallen completely silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. All eyes were on Riley and Wellington as they stood facing each other, the tension between them so thick you could almost touch it. Ambassador Richardson had taken a step back, recognizing that his attempts to calm the situation had failed completely. Riley's face was red with anger and frustration. Everything about this assignment had gone wrong from the very beginning. He had come here expecting to provide real security consultation, to use his skills and experience to help protect important people. Instead, he had spent the day dealing with bureaucracy, protocol, and a guard who seemed more interested in looking perfect than actually doing his job. Wellington stood perfectly straight, his military bearing intact despite the verbal assault he had endured for the past several minutes. His hands remained at his sides, his expression controlled, but there was something different in his eyes now. The professional patience was still there, but underneath it was the quiet anger of a man who had been insulted one too many times. The crowd of onlookers had grown to include nearly half the reception guests. Diplomats, embassy staff, and visitors from a dozen different countries all watched in stunned silence as the confrontation played out before them. Many had their phones out, some recording video, others frantically typing messages to colleagues and superiors. Riley took another step closer to Wellington, closing the distance between them to less than 3 feet. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "You think that standing around in a fancy uniform makes you some kind of real security professional. But when it comes to actually making decisions, actually taking action, you're useless." Wellington's jaw tightened, but he maintained his disciplined stance. Years of training had taught him to control his reactions, to stay calm under pressure, to never let emotions override duty. But Riley's words were hitting their mark, attacking not just his methods but his competence and dedication. "I have served my country for 8 years, Wellington said quietly, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "I have protected members of the royal family, served in combat zones, and handled security for dozens of international events. I do not need to prove my competence to you." Riley laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the embassy walls. "Combat zones, really? Well, this isn't a combat zone, buddy. This is the real world, where security professionals need to be able to think on their feet and adapt to situations. Not just stand around like a statue waiting for orders." The insult hit home. Wellington had spent months in Afghanistan, had been shot at, had lost friends in the line of duty. To have his service dismissed so casually by someone who knew nothing about his background was almost unbearable. But still, his training held. He remained at attention, his hands at his sides. Ambassador Richardson could see the situation was about to explode. He stepped forward again, his voice urgent. "Detective Thompson, I really must insist that you step back and allow us to resolve this through proper channels. This is neither the time nor the place for this kind of confrontation." But Riley was beyond listening to reason. All his frustration with the assignment, with the protocols, with what he saw as Wellington's stubborn refusal to accept help, had boiled over into real anger. "Proper channels," he repeated mockingly. "That's all you people know how to say. Proper channels, protocols, authorization. What happens when there's an actual emergency?" Do you ask the bad guys to wait while you fill out paperwork? Wellington's control was starting to crack. Sir, you have no understanding of what proper security protocols involve. They exist to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Unprofessional. Behavior that compromises everyone's safety. Unprofessional? Riley's voice rose to a shout that could be heard throughout the entire courtyard. I'll show you unprofessional. I've been trying to help you for the past half hour, and all you've done is quote regulations and act like you're too good to listen to advice from someone who actually knows what they're doing. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as Riley stepped even closer to Wellington. Several people gasped audibly. The woman with the press badge made sure her phone was capturing everything, recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented. Wellington could feel Riley's breath on his face now. Every instinct told him to step back, to create distance, to defuse the situation. But his orders were clear: maintain his position, do not abandon his post. He stood his ground, looking straight ahead, trying to ignore the man who was now practically nose to nose with him. Look at me when I'm talking to you, Riley demanded, his voice now a growl of pure frustration. You think you're so disciplined, so professional, standing there like a robot. But you know what you really are? You're a joke. A tourist attraction in a fancy costume. That was the final straw. Wellington's eyes snapped to meet Riley's, real anger flashing in them for the first time. Sir, I have shown you every courtesy and professional respect, but I will not stand here and allow you to insult my service or my dedication to duty. Riley saw the anger in Wellington's eyes and felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, he had gotten a reaction. Finally, the perfect statue was showing some human emotion. There we go, he said with a cruel smile. Finally acting like a real person, instead of a wind-up toy. The insult was calculated and deliberate, designed to provoke exactly the kind of reaction that would prove Riley's point about Wellington's lack of real-world readiness. But Riley had misjudged the situation completely. He thought Wellington's discipline was weakness, that his adherence to protocol was inflexibility. He had no understanding of the self-control it took to remain professional under such provocation. Wellington's hands trembled slightly with the effort of maintaining his composure. 8 years of military service, countless hours of training, dozens of successful missions, all of it was being dismissed and mocked by someone who had been at the embassy for less than 4 hours. You have crossed every line of professional behavior, Wellington said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I have tried to explain my position, tried to work with you, but you refuse to show even basic respect for the duties I have been assigned. Riley felt a moment of triumph. He had finally broken through Wellington's robotic facade, had proven that underneath all that discipline was just another person who could be rattled. In his mind, this proved everything he had been saying about the inadequacy of Wellington's training and approach. Respect? Riley said, his voice dripping with contempt. You want respect? Earn it. Stop hiding behind your precious protocols and start acting like a real security professional. The crowd held its breath. Ambassador Richardson looked pale, clearly understanding that this confrontation was spiraling far beyond anything that could be easily contained or explained away. Embassy staff were speaking urgently into radios, calling for backup, for supervisors, for anyone who might be able to stop what was happening. Wellington stood frozen in place, torn between his duty to maintain his post and his natural human response to the ongoing assault on his character and competence. His training said to remain calm, to not respond to provocation, to maintain discipline no matter what. But 15 minutes of non-stop insults and mockery had pushed him to the very edge of his self-control. Riley saw the internal struggle playing out on Wellington's face and decided to push just a little harder. In his mind, he was teaching an important lesson about the difference between real security work and ceremonial posturing. He had no idea that he was about to cross a line that would change everything for both of them. The moment hung in the air, like a held breath, with dozens of witnesses watching and recording, waiting to see what would happen next in this unprecedented confrontation between two very different approaches to duty, discipline and professional pride. The sound of Riley's hand hitting Wellington's face echoed across the silent courtyard like a gunshot. For a split second, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The entire reception seemed frozen in time as the reality of what had just happened sank. Riley stood there with his hand still raised, breathing hard, his face a mixture of anger and sudden realization. He had lost control completely. In 15 years of law enforcement, he had never struck someone who was not actively threatening him or others. But something about Wellington's calm, disciplined response to every insult had pushed him beyond his breaking point. Wellington's face was turned to the side from the impact, a red mark already forming on his left cheek. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked completely. His eyes showed shock, pain, and something that looked like disbelief. He slowly turned his head back to face forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his cheek before stopping halfway. The crowd of witnesses erupted into gasps and shocked exclamations. Someone screamed. Others stepped backward, as if the violence might somehow spread to them. The woman with the press badge held her phone steady, making sure she captured every second of the aftermath, but Wellington's response was not what anyone expected, least of all Riley. Instead of striking back, instead of losing his temper or abandoning his post, Wellington did something that would later be called remarkable by security experts around the world. He took a deep breath, straightened his already perfect posture, and reached for the small communication device attached to his uniform. "Control, this is Wellington at position 3, he said, his voice amazingly steady despite what had just happened. "I need immediate assistance. An American law enforcement officer has just committed assault on embassy grounds." Riley stared at him in complete confusion. In every confrontation he had ever been in, when someone got hit, they either hit back or they backed down. They did not calmly radio for backup while standing at attention. This was not how fights worked. This was not how people reacted to being attacked. "I also need embassy security, local police, and notification of the incident to both British and American authorities," Wellington continued into his radio. "We have multiple witnesses, and the incident was recorded on several devices." The professional calm in Wellington's voice seemed to shock Riley out of his anger-induced haze. Suddenly, he realized what he had done. He had just struck a foreign security officer on embassy grounds in front of dozens of witnesses while representing American law enforcement. The implications hit him like a freight train. Ambassador Richardson was the first person to recover from the shock. He rushed forward, his face pale with horror at what he had witnessed. "Dear God," he muttered, looking back and forth between Riley and Wellington. "This is a disaster. An absolute disaster." Riley finally seemed to understand the enormity of his mistake. "Look, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just trying to make a point about security protocols, and he wouldn't listen, and—" "You struck a royal guard," the ambassador said, his voice trembling with barely controlled panic. "On British sovereign territory? In front of diplomatic personnel from a dozen countries? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Wellington continued his radio communication with the same professional tone he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "Yes, sir. The incident is contained. The subject appears to be experiencing some kind of shock reaction." "No, sir. I do not require medical attention. The situation is under control." Riley watched in growing amazement as Wellington calmly coordinated the response to his own assault. The guard's face still bore the red mark from the slap, but he showed no signs of anger, no desire for revenge, no loss of composure. If anything, he seemed more focused and professional than ever. "How are you so calm right now?" Riley asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just hit you, in front of all these people." "Why aren't you angry?" Wellington looked at him directly for the first time since the incident. "Sir, being angry would not help this situation. My job is to maintain security and handle threats professionally. Right now, you represent a security concern that needs to be managed according to proper protocols." The response was so unexpected, so completely different from anything Riley had encountered in his career, that he found himself speechless. In his world, when someone attacked you, you defended yourself. When someone disrespected you, you showed the was boss. You did not treat your attacker like a security problem to be handled with paperwork and procedure. Embassy staff were now flooding into the courtyard. Men and women in dark suits spoke urgently into radios and phones, coordinating what was clearly becoming a major international incident. Riley could hear fragments of conversations about diplomatic immunity, international law, and immediate notification of superiors. Within minutes, the sound of sirens could be heard approaching the embassy. Multiple sirens from different directions, growing louder by the second. Riley realized that Wellington's calm radio call had set in motion a response that would involve local police, federal authorities, and probably officials from both the American and British governments. This is really happening, Riley said to himself, the full reality of the situation finally sinking in. This is really actually happening. Wellington overheard him and responded in the same steady voice he had used throughout the entire incident. Yes, sir, it is happening. Actions have consequences, even when they occur in the heat of the moment. A tall man in a British military uniform came jogging across the courtyard, his face grim with concern. This was clearly Wellington's commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, who had been summoned from his meetings by the emergency call. "Wellington report?" the colonel said briskly, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. "Sir, Detective Thompson became increasingly agitated about my position during the reception. When I explained that I could not move without authorization, he became verbally aggressive and then struck me across the face. The incident was witnessed by approximately 30 people and recorded on multiple devices." Colonel Hayes looked at Riley with a mixture of disbelief and barely controlled anger. "Detective, is this accurate?" Riley wanted to explain, to justify his actions, to make the colonel understand how frustrating Wellington had been. But looking at the two British officers, both standing at perfect attention despite the chaos around them, he realized that no explanation would matter now. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, "it's accurate." The first police cars were pulling up to the embassy gates now, their lights flashing red and blue across the elegant courtyard. Riley could see officers getting out, speaking with embassy guards, preparing to enter the grounds. His own department would be notified soon, if they had not been already. Wellington remained at his post. Despite having been assaulted, despite the chaos around him, despite having every reason to abandon his duties, he stood exactly where he had been assigned to stand, doing exactly what he had been trained to do. The red mark on his face was already fading, but the professional respect he had earned from everyone watching would last much longer. Riley realized that in trying to prove Wellington was unprofessional, he had instead demonstrated the exact opposite. The guard's calm, measured response to being attacked had shown a level of discipline and training that Riley was only now beginning to understand. As the police entered the courtyard and approached them, Riley knew that his career, his reputation, and his future had all been changed forever by one moment of lost control. The police officers entered the embassy courtyard like they were walking into a crime scene, which in many ways they were. 3 local patrol cars had arrived first, followed quickly by unmarked vehicles carrying detectives and federal agents. The flashing lights painted the elegant embassy walls in alternating red and blue, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. Riley watched them approach with a growing sense of dread. These were his colleagues, people he had worked with for years, and now they were coming to arrest him. The lead officer was Detective Chun, someone Riley had shared coffee with just last week. Now Chen was looking at him with a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "Riley, what the hell happened here?" Chen asked, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. He had known Riley for 8 years, had worked dozens of cases with him, and had never seen him lose control like this. Riley opened his mouth to explain, but found himself struggling to find the right words. How could he explain that a simple security consultation had turned into an international incident? How could he make anyone understand the frustration that had led to this moment? "I was trying to improve the security setup," Riley began, his voice shaky. "The guard was being unreasonable, wouldn't listen to suggestions, and I just I lost my temper." Chen looked over at Wellington, who was still standing at perfect attention despite everything that had happened. The red mark on the guard's face was clearly visible, and Chen could see at least 20 witnesses still standing around the courtyard, many of them with their phones out. "You hit a royal guard?" Chen said slowly, as if he was having trouble believing his own words. "On embassy property? In front of all these people?" Meanwhile, Colonel Hayes was conducting his own investigation. He moved through the crowd of witnesses, speaking quietly with embassy staff and guests, gathering statements about what they had seen and heard. His military bearing and calm demeanor helped restore some sense of order to the chaotic scene. Ambassador Richardson was on his phone, speaking in urgent, hushed tones with what were clearly very important people. Riley caught fragments of the conversation, phrases like international incident, immediate damage control, and notify the Foreign Office immediately. The video footage was already spreading beyond the embassy grounds. The woman with the press badge had uploaded her recording to social media within minutes of the incident, and it was being shared and reposted faster than anyone could track. Within an hour, the footage would be on news websites around the world. Wellington continued to answer questions from Colonel Hayes with the same professional precision he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "Sir, Detective Thompson approached me at approximately 15:30 hours with concerns about my position. I explained that I could not move without authorization. The conversation escalated over approximately 15 minutes before he struck me." "Did you provoke him in any way?" Colonel Hayes asked. "No, sir. I maintained professional courtesy throughout the interaction and explained our protocols as clearly as possible." Riley listened to this exchange with growing amazement. Even now, even after being assaulted, Wellington was giving a factual, unbiased account of what had happened. He was not trying to make Riley look worse or himself look better. He was simply stating the facts. Detective Chun had finished taking preliminary statements from several witnesses, and their accounts all matched perfectly with Wellington's version of events. Riley had become increasingly agitated, had insulted Wellington repeatedly, and had finally struck him without any physical provocation. "Riley, I have to place you under arrest," Chun said, pulling out his handcuffs. "You know the drill." The words hit Riley like a physical blow. He had arrested hundreds of people over his career, had recited the Miranda rights countless times, but he had never imagined being on the receiving end. The cold metal of the handcuffs around his wrists felt surreal, like this was happening to someone else. "You have the right to remain silent," Chun began, his voice heavy with regret. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Chin continued reading Riley his rights, embassy staff were working frantically to manage the diplomatic fallout. The British government had been notified within minutes of the incident, and American officials were being briefed as quickly as secure communications could be established. Ambassador Richardson finished his phone call and approached Colonel Hayes. "Colonel, I need to know, what are the implications under international law? We're dealing with an assault on a representative of the Crown on British sovereign territory." Colonel Hayes considered the question carefully. "Sir, this creates multiple legal complications. Detective Thompson was here in an official capacity, but his actions were clearly outside the scope of his duties. Wellington was performing his assigned role as a royal guard when he was assaulted. The crowd of diplomatic guests was slowly being moved to other areas of the embassy, but many were reluctant to leave. This was the kind of incident that would be talked about for years in diplomatic circles. An American law enforcement officer assaulting a British royal guard was unprecedented in modern times. Riley's supervisor, Captain Martinez, arrived at the embassy looking like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. He had received the call while in a budget meeting with the mayor and had rushed over without fully understanding what had happened. "Thompson, what in God's name were you thinking?" Martinez demanded, looking at Riley with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Riley tried again to explain, but the words sounded weak even to him. "Captain, I was trying to do my job. The security setup was all wrong, and the guard wouldn't listen to reason. So you hit him?" Martinez's voice rose with incredulity. "You thought the appropriate response to a security disagreement was assault?" Wellington overheard this exchange and, for the first time since the incident, spoke directly to Riley's supervisor. "Sir, if I may," Detective Thompson did seem genuinely concerned about security matters. His methods were inappropriate, but his intentions appeared to be professional in nature. Even now, even after being attacked and humiliated, Wellington was trying to provide some context that might help Riley. It was an act of grace that left everyone who heard it slightly stunned. Captain Martinez looked at Wellington with obvious respect. "That's very generous of you, but it doesn't change what happened here." The local news crews were already setting up outside the embassy gates. Word of the incident had leaked quickly, and reporters who covered diplomatic affairs knew this was a major story. An American police officer assaulting a British Royal Guard would be front-page news around the world. Federal agents were now involved as well. Since the incident had occurred on foreign soil and involved international law, they would need to coordinate with British authorities, the State Department, and multiple other agencies to determine exactly what charges Riley would face and in which jurisdiction. As Riley was led toward the police car, he looked back at Wellington one final time. The guard was still standing at his assigned post, still doing his duty despite everything that had happened. His uniform was still perfect, his posture still impeccable, his professionalism still intact. For the first time since the confrontation began, Riley truly understood what he had been dealing with. Wellington was not just a ceremonial guard or a tourist attraction. He was a highly trained professional who had demonstrated grace under pressure that Riley could only dream of achieving. The police car door closed behind Riley with a sound that seemed to echo across the courtyard. As they drove away from the embassy, he realized that his life as he knew it was over, and it had all been destroyed by one moment of uncontrolled anger. 6 months later, Riley sat in the cramped office of his court-appointed attorney, staring at a stack of legal documents that represented the complete destruction of everything he had worked for over the past 15 years. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the paperwork that would determine his future. The video had gone viral within hours of the incident. By the next morning, it had been viewed millions of times across every social media platform imaginable. News outlets around the world had picked up the story, and Riley's face had become instantly recognizable as the cop who slapped a royal guard. "The prosecution is offering a plea deal," his attorney, Ms. Patterson, said wearily. She had been handling Riley's case pro bono, partly out of sympathy and partly because the high-profile nature of the case would boost her career. Guilty plea to assault, 6 months probation, anger management classes, and a public apology. Riley rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar headache that had plagued him for months. "What if I fight it? What if we go to trial?" Ms. Patterson pulled out her tablet and showed him the video again. Riley had watched it hundreds of times by now, but it never got easier to see. There he was, clearly losing his temper, clearly striking Wellington without any provocation. The audio was crystal clear, too. Every insult, every aggressive word he had spoken was captured for posterity. "Riley, we've been through this. The evidence is overwhelming. 27 witnesses, multiple video angles, and audio that captures everything you said. A jury trial would likely result in a much harsher sentence. The federal charges had been the most serious: assault on foreign soil, violation of diplomatic protocols, and conduct unbecoming of a law enforcement officer. The FBI had conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing everyone who was at the embassy that day. Their report had been damning. Riley's termination from the police department had been swift and absolute. Captain Martinez had held a press conference the day after the incident, condemning Riley's actions and emphasizing that they did not represent the values of the department. The video of that press conference had been almost as painful to watch as the original incident. "What about my pension?" Riley asked, though he already knew the answer. "Gone. Termination for cause means you forfeit all benefits. We've been through this too." The financial consequences had been devastating. Legal fees, even with a court-appointed attorney, had drained Riley's savings. He had been forced to sell his house and move in with his brother. Job prospects for an ex-cop with a criminal record and international notoriety were essentially non-existent. Meanwhile, the legal complexities of the case had created a diplomatic headache that reached the highest levels of both governments. The State Department had issued multiple apologies to the British government. Congressional hearings had been held about the training and supervision of law enforcement officers assigned to diplomatic duties. Riley picked up a newspaper clipping that Miss Patterson had included in his file. The headline read, "Royal Guard receives commendation for grace under fire." The article described how Wellington had been formally recognized by both British and American officials for his professional handling of the assault. According to the article, Wellington had been promoted to senior guard and was now an instructor at the Royal Military Academy, teaching courses on conflict de-escalation and professional composure. He had given several interviews about the incident, always emphasizing the importance of training and discipline in high-stress situations. "He never said anything bad about me," Riley muttered, reading the article again. "Even in these interviews, he just talks about training and protocols." "He could have destroyed me completely, but he didn't," Miss Patterson nodded. "That probably worked in your favor during plea negotiations." The prosecutors noted that the victim showed remarkable restraint and professionalism throughout the incident and afterward. Riley had tried to contact Wellington several times through official channels, hoping to apologize personally. But embassy protocol and ongoing legal proceedings had made direct communication impossible. He had written letters that were never delivered, made phone calls that were never returned. The media attention had been relentless for the first few months. Riley's name had become synonymous with police misconduct and international embarrassment. Late-night talk show hosts had made jokes about him. Social media users had turned his moment of anger into countless memes and viral videos. "The British government could have pushed for much harsher charges," Ms. Patterson explained. "Assault on a representative of the Crown on sovereign territory could have resulted in years in prison. But they've been surprisingly lenient, probably in the interest of maintaining diplomatic relations." Riley knew he had gotten off easy, relatively speaking. The incident could have sparked a major international crisis. Instead, both governments had worked to minimize the damage and move forward as quickly as possible. His family had suffered too. His wife had filed for divorce 3 months after the incident, unable to handle the constant media attention and public humiliation. His teenage daughter had been forced to change schools when classmates recognized her from news reports. His son had stopped talking to him entirely. "There's something else," Ms. Patterson said, pulling out another document. "The embassy has requested that you be permanently banned from entering any British diplomatic facility worldwide. It's not legally binding, but it's part of the administrative consequences." Riley laughed bitterly. "I don't think I'll be doing much diplomatic security work in the future anyway." The case had become a training example in law enforcement academies across the country. Videos of the incident were now shown to cadets as an example of how quickly a situation could spiral out of control. Riley's 15 years of good service had been erased by 15 seconds of poor judgment. His former colleagues had mostly avoided him since the incident. A few had reached out privately to express sympathy, but most had distanced themselves completely. The police fraternity was tight-knit, but it did not protect members who brought shame to the badge. "I keep thinking about what he said," Riley admitted to his attorney. "Wellington. Right after I hit him, he said that actions have consequences. Even in the heat of the moment, he was right." Miss Patterson closed the file and looked at Riley with a mixture of professional sympathy and personal sadness. "The plea hearing is next week. Are you ready to accept responsibility and move forward?" Riley nodded slowly. He had spent months reliving that day, analyzing every decision that had led to the moment of impact. The security concerns that had seemed so important at the time now felt trivial compared to the destruction they had caused. "You know what the worst part is?" Riley said, standing up to leave. "I was wrong about everything. Wellington's position was fine. The security was adequate. I created the only real threat at that reception, and I was supposed to be there to prevent threats." As Riley walked out of the attorney's office and into the afternoon sunlight, he thought about the video that had defined his life for the past 6 months. Millions of people had watched him lose control, had seen his moment of weakness and poor judgment. But they had also seen something else. They had seen what real professionalism looked like in the face of adversity. Wellington had become a symbol of grace under pressure, while Riley had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of letting anger override judgment. The roles they would be remembered for were exactly the opposite of what Riley had expected when he first walked into that embassy courtyard. 2 years after the incident that changed everything, Riley sat in a community college classroom, watching a group of criminal justice students analyze the very video that had destroyed his career. The irony was not lost on him. He was now a part-time security guard at a shopping mall, making barely enough to cover his rent in a small apartment across town. The professor, Dr. Williams, paused the video at the exact moment of impact. Can anyone identify the specific point where Detective Thompson crossed the line from professional disagreement to criminal behavior? A young student raised her hand. When he invaded the guard's personal space and started making it personal instead of professional. Riley shifted uncomfortably in his seat at the back of the classroom. He was taking night classes, trying to earn a degree in social work, one of the few career paths still open to him. The students had no idea that the man they were analyzing was sitting just a few rows behind them. Exactly, Dr. Williams continued. Notice how the Royal Guard maintains his composure throughout the entire incident. This is a perfect example of de-escalation through non-engagement. Riley had watched this video hundreds of times over the past 2 years, but seeing it analyzed in an academic setting was particularly painful. Every gesture, every word, every decision he had made that day was dissected and criticized by people who had never faced a high-stress situation in their lives. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, Wellington was finishing his morning briefing. At the Royal Military Academy, his office walls were decorated with commendations and certificates, including a special recognition from the American Embassy for exceptional professionalism in the face of adversity. Today we're going to discuss situation control and emotional regulation, Wellington told his class of young guards in training. I want to share with you a real-world example of how proper training can help you handle even the most challenging circumstances. Wellington had become something of a celebrity in military and security circles. His calm response to being assaulted had been studied by police academies, military schools, and diplomatic security services around the world. He had written articles for professional journals and given speeches at international conferences, but Wellington rarely spoke about Riley personally in his lectures. Instead, he focused on the principles and training that had helped him maintain control. He understood that the incident had destroyed one man's life, and he felt no need to add to that destruction. Back in the community college classroom, Riley listened as Dr. Williams explained the long-term consequences of the incident. The diplomatic implications lasted for months. Both governments had to work hard to repair the damage to their relationship. Riley thought about his own long-term consequences. His marriage was over. His relationship with his children remained strained. His career in law enforcement was finished forever. He had lost his house, his pension, and his reputation. All for 15 seconds of anger that he would give anything to take back. The job at the mall was humbling work for someone who had once led SWAT operations. He spent his days checking receipts, watching for shoplifters, and breaking up the occasional argument between teenagers. His supervisor was a 25-year-old kid who had no idea about Riley's background. Sometimes, late at night, Riley would walk through the empty mall corridors and think about how different his life might have been if he had just walked away from that confrontation. If he had accepted Wellington's explanation and moved on to other security concerns, if he had controlled his temper and acted like the professional he was supposed to be, the video of the incident was still used in training programs across the country. Riley's moment of weakness had become a teaching tool, helping thousands of other law enforcement officers understand the importance of self-control and professional behavior. Wellington, meanwhile, had used his newfound prominence to advocate for better conflict resolution training in security services. He had developed new curriculum for handling tense situations with civilians, drawing on his experience to help other guards avoid similar confrontations. The key, Wellington would tell his students, is to remember that your job is to protect and serve, not to prove that you're right. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is absorb someone's anger without responding in kind. Riley had tried several times over the past 2 years to find work in security or law enforcement, but the background checks always came back with the same result. The incident at the embassy had made him unemployable in any position that required trust and judgment. He had considered moving to another state, maybe even another country, but the video had made him recognizable almost everywhere. The internet never forgets, and his moment of poor judgment would follow him for the rest of his life. The community college professor wrapped up his lecture with a discussion of accountability and consequences. Notice that Detective Thompson never tried to deny what he had done or blame others for his actions. In his statement to the court, he took full responsibility for his behavior. Riley remembered that court appearance vividly. Standing before the judge, admitting his guilt, apologizing to Wellington and the British government. It had been one of the hardest things he had ever done, but also one of the most necessary. After class, Riley walked to his car in the nearly empty parking lot. He had to get to his night shift at the mall, where he would spend 8 hours walking the same corridors and thinking about the choices that had brought him to this point. As he drove through the city, Riley passed the police station where he had once worked. Some of his former colleagues were probably finishing their shifts right now, going home to their families and their futures, lives that continued to move forward while his remained frozen in the consequences of that one terrible day. Wellington, finishing his own day's work at the military academy, looked out his office window at the young guards practicing their drills. In the courtyard below, they moved with precision and discipline, the same qualities that had saved him from making Riley's mistake. He had received letters from Riley over the years, apologies, expressions of regret, attempts to make some kind of amends. Wellington had read them all but never responded. Not out of cruelty, but because he understood that Riley's path to redemption had to be his own journey. The incident had taught Wellington valuable lessons too. It had shown him the importance of staying calm under pressure, the power of proper training, and the devastating consequences that could result from a single moment of lost control. At the mall, Riley began his evening rounds, checking locks and monitoring the security cameras. It was quiet work, anonymous work, far removed from the high-stakes world he had once inhabited. But it was honest work, and it gave him time to think about who he wanted to become. He had started volunteering at a local youth center, teaching kids about conflict resolution and the importance of controlling their tempers. It was his way of trying to prevent others from making his mistake. The irony that he was now teaching the very lessons he had failed to learn was not lost on him. 2 years later, both men continued to live with the consequences of that afternoon at the embassy. Wellington had used the experience to build a successful teaching career and become a respected voice in his field. Riley had lost everything but was slowly trying to rebuild his life and find meaning in helping others avoid his mistakes. The video would outlive them both. A permanent reminder that in our connected world, one moment of poor judgment can echo through eternity, and that true strength lies not in showing power over others, but in maintaining control over ourselves.